Hi, everyone. I know we have a number of guests in the room, so I'm going to take a moment just to introduce myself. I'm Sharon Haar, and I am chair of the architecture program here at Taubman College. And I want to welcome everyone to our annual Architecture Fellows presentation and opening. As I think many of you know, this is one of my favorite introductions, or probably my favorite introduction of the year, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But first, a word from our team. Just remind all of the students and faculty and others in the room that we have a busy week coming up next week with the Sue Fujimoto lecture on Tuesday at 6 o'clock and many other exciting lectures and other events, including the spring exhibition. So while the fellow show is often towards the end of activities, we have a few more exciting public events that will be happening after this opening as we lead into final reviews and graduation. But now to the main event. So this year's fellows will tell us themselves in their own words, perhaps, or will infer from their words why Things Around Us is an appropriate title for this year's fellows exhibition and work. Having had a sneak peek in the room last night while no one was looking, I can tell you that Things Around Us seems to be an appropriate term for this exhibition and for their collective work. And I want to just say a couple of words about why I so much enjoy doing the introduction to this series of short talks. One is because it's really, frankly, an honor to be part of through the fellowship search committee and its activities, through welcoming the fellows every year to the college, and to doing this introduction and a modicum of mentoring to be part of this incredibly robust tradition here at Taubman College. And so, as I've done a couple of times in the past, any faculty member who is in the room who was at one time a fellow, if you would raise your hand. Okay, so so the more recent fellows tend to sit towards the front, but we've got some true, hey, folks in the back. The fellowship is really such an important part of the trajectory of Taubman College, and particularly of the architecture program, particularly this year, because we have a fellow who was a student at Taubman College. Without further ado, because again, I think they have a lot more interesting things to say than I do, I'm just going to do very quick introductions for each of the fellows in the order that they will present, which is apparently very deep thinking. It's alphabetical. So the William A. Oberdick Fellow for this year is Gabriel Cuéllar. Gabriel is an architect and writer who was, before he came to visit us here, based in New York. He studied at Carnegie Mellon University and received his postgraduate degree from the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam. He's exhibited work at Parsons School of Design, the House of World Cultures, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and the Netherlands Architecture Institute, and with his partner, Atara Mufra, he and their firm Theaster were the winners of one of the winners of last year's Architectural League Prize Awards. So we will welcome first Gabriel. The second person to present will be Liz Galvez, the Muschenheim, this year's Muschenheim Fellow. Liz received her Master of Architecture from MIT, where she was awarded the Department of Architecture Graduate Fellowship, and also studied afterwards in Austria as the recipient of the Seebacher Prize for Fine Arts. Under the American Austrian Foundation. She's taught at the Boston Architectural College and served as a critic at many schools, including RISD and MIT. And she's worked at quite a variety of firms, including Nada, Will Bruder Architects, and Roaching Architectos. And I think you'll see some throughputs from her thesis work at MIT that has come to an incredible fruition here in our galleries. And so it's also exciting to see what folks say they're going to present or their project, and then what actually comes to pass in under our roof. And last but not least is this year's Walter B. Sanders Fellow, De Peter Yee, who is an architect and designer. He holds his Bachelor of Science from the illustrious University of Michigan, where he won the Wallenberg Award, and his Master's of Architecture from Rice University, where he won quite a number of awards as well. He was awarded a 2016 Graham Foundation grant for his forthcoming publication, Building Subjects, a proposal for housing's anachronistic parts. And I think there's some, again, throughput from some of those ideas in the work that we'll see today. He's practiced with Studio Gang Architects in Chicago, WW Architecture in Houston, and 1100 Architect in New York. We're glad to have Peter here back with us this year. I know that each one of the fellows is going to have their own individuals to thank, and also some collective thanks as well. But I want to thank a number of people also. First, last year's Fellowship Search Committee, who worked very diligently to bring these three incredible young architects to us. To the facilities staff, who worked really hard to prep the room for them, which, as always, was never quite ready and in good repair for them. To all of the students who really were so much a part, I've been witnessing, of helping to see the work come to fruition. To Irene Huang, the assistant chair of the architecture program, who I know did quite a bit of mentoring to see the projects through. And also to some of the sponsors that have been really helpful with providing materials for the production of the work, including Kohler. So with that, I am going to introduce this year's fellow.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So we wanted to start off the presentations with just a few minutes of the three of us up here together. So first of all, thank you all for taking the time to be here with us tonight. On behalf of Gabriel, Peter, and myself, I would like to thank a series of people without whom this event would not have been possible. We would like to thank Sharon Haar, John McMurrow, and last year's Fellowship Committee for allowing us not only the opportunity to develop our work and to contribute to the wonderful culture here at Taubman College, but also for bringing the three of us together. To the Taubman community, thank you for your support and encouragement throughout the past 2 semesters. Collectively, we would also like to thank Bill Manspeaker, Carlos Pompeo, Asa Peller, Kelly Moore, for answering all of our incessant questions and helping us translate our thoughts from the digital worlds into the physical. Lastly, we would like to thank our students, those who took on our prompts, those who challenged us in our courses, those who engaged in curious conversation with us. With your diligence and laughter, you've made our time here truly a rewarding experience. From the three of us, a big thank you.
And Gabriel and I will just offer a few words about the shared collective topic of this year's fellowship project. So, as you will hopefully see in the exhibition this year is kind of presents a collective dialogue that the three of us had over the past year rather than necessarily kind of three completely disparate projects. So this is the text which is in the poster. Things around us departs from a preoccupation with everyday elements and institutions that govern architecture and its production. Such elements are inherently spatial, material, and organizational, and therefore constitutive of the discipline.
They are also, importantly, coexistent with social, political, and cultural constructs, as well as other disciplines. Through the analytical investigation and projective exploration of three basic features, plumbing, property, parts, this year's exhibition aims to articulate some ways in which heteronomy can enrich the implicit discipline. In a wider view, the fellowship projects demonstrate that architecture concerns not only the design of freestanding buildings or images, but the vast and precise array of things around us.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be here finally. Past few weeks have been pretty intense. Okay. Full screen mode. Okay, so to begin, I want to express. Oh, yikes. Technician. Too much? A little bit bigger? Perhaps a bit down if you could. That looks pretty good, thank you. Okay, I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to all the people who have contributed so instrumentally to the fellowship. These people include Reed Miller, Victoria C., Claire Coburn, Jordan Vogt, Edward Falkowski, Karun Chukasrani, Jacob Piles, and Mick Kennedy. The work that you'll find in the gallery is very much a product of collaboration with them. And I cannot imagine a better partner than Athara Mufre. She's incredible, and I would say in every sense, an Oberdick Fellow as well. The basic premise that we have been working on is that architecture concerns and consists not only of buildings, but the environment in its totality. Beyond the footprint of any given building, we can find a diverse array of architecture, although architects are rarely involved in its design. From this starting point, we have been working on the relationship of architecture and real property. Real property, commonly known as land, is the legal and social institution that organizes and qualifies matter and space. It is one of the foremost infrastructures responsible for the performance of the environment. This is a recent New York Times map that you may have seen. It purports to show, to depict the built legacy of the United States. What is absent from this representation, which you can see privileges the figure over the ground, is the infrastructural medium in which these figures are situated. The white space, right, is empty, the property lines. Although significantly legal in character and not observable with the naked eye, real property is spatial and its governance is manifold. Nevertheless, it is institutionalized to the degree that architects rarely distinguish its rule. Real property imbricates a multitude of matters, but its organizational reach extends primarily vis-a-vis intervals of land. Through the discrete and interminable parcelization of land, real property facilitates the instrumentalization of space and matter. Under land division and ownership regimes, surfaces, volumes, and temporalities of earthly material are mobilized to expedite social relations of human societies. These intervals ultimately predispose the environment and situate how resources are conceived and classified. Over the past few months in the fellowship, I have been reading a lot of legal and economic theory to understand and get my head around property. And I developed a few points from the architectural point of view that I think might help give some signposts for the discussion of real property within our discipline. Firstly, real property deserves a nuanced approach that does not rely strictly on binaries of public-private, private-common, owners, tenants, capitalist, socialist. Property is much more a multidimensional spectrum than a two-sided coin, and varying degrees of access, stakes, cooperation, and boundary articulation ought to be explored in contrast to the wholesale characterizations of exclusion, absolute dominion, and market predominance. Secondly, property is a neutral institution that acquires its political charge from specific authorities in specific contexts, not universally. So, calls for the abolition of private property or calls for private property being intrinsically inequitable, I would argue, could have further consideration. For societies that are fixed in the private property construct, it might be more transformative to imagine second best scenarios that depart from the current reality rather than propose widespread communal ownership. And the third, lastly, while real property operates within the sphere of capitalist competition, it is not destined to be a zero-sum game. By designing mutual benefits, neighborly agreements, and synergies of supply and demand, the infrastructure of property can prompt scenarios in which adversaries all stand to gain from certain interactions. In the gallery, you will see a book that we have produced, which contains an essay and a glossary. The essay discusses the architectural significance of property, particularly in the United States, and how property has been instrumental in the creation of the national subject, the landowner or the homeowner. The essay also sets forth the argument that real property is an infrastructural medium, but also, very importantly, an architectural measure in itself, having order, geometry, edge, and scale. The glossary, which was important to really understand all the legal aspects behind property, outlines, in fact, how law around property is actually very spatial. One of the best places to see the connection of real property and architecture is the typical American urban plan, prevalent across the US. I'm sure you're familiar with this. This plan and all the plans are premised on the deployment of a generic interval. But the dimensional attributes of this interval reveal a profoundly material connection between real property and architecture. From New York City to Boston, to Ann Arbor, Chicago, Kansas City, Denver, Houston, San Francisco, wherever, one finds the same urban parcel measuring approximately 20 feet in width and 100 feet in depth. The origin of this dimension lies in the fact that the timber industry produced standardized dimensions of lumber commodities. The largest commercially available member, a 3-inch by 12-inch Douglas fir floor joist, was structurally capable of spanning precisely 20 feet under residential and commercial live loads. The 3 by 12 floor joist, used pervasively in the 19th and early 20th century building construction, thereby inaugurated this interval, the standard open span interval of the United States. Spanning from property line to property line, from bearing wall to bearing wall, the 3 by 12 joist exhibits the practical and contingent nature of North American building and territory. Whereas architectural culture has long praised, adored, made myths about the column, the typical urban building, responding to the demands of real property, did entirely without them, expeditiously doing away with the column's visual formal cues and tectonic prestige. The 3 by 12 joist literally held up the economic infrastructure of the United States. This timber commodity facilitated the multiplication of square footages that came to accommodate the nation's preoccupation with land. In the gallery, you will find an original salvaged 3 by 12 floor joist, which we have annotated as a gigantic ruler. The wood was cut in northern Michigan, was installed in a building in Detroit, and that's where we found it. The global patchwork of parcels has arguably determined some of the basic categories of architecture, both its production and profession. So think for a second, let's consider the client, the site, and the envelope. Client. Without a commissioning landowner, for whom would an architect work? If there were no property lines, where would architecture stop? Without a guaranteed patch of land, where would architecture situate itself? Indeed, what would architecture be without these categories, in great part originating in the real property medium? the discipline would do well to engage real property as an architectural product in itself. Scholarly treatments of land classify private, public, and common types of property, but the legal feature that actually enables these differences between public, private, common, the legal interest might permit a more effective gradient. What is the interest? The interest is the legal right, the stakes, the concerns, and shares that an entity holds in land. So having an interest means that you are, in a way, imbricated in real property. Interests are spatial, material, temporal, and relational, and they relate to all forms of real property. They bind entities to spaces and resources. Architects aiming to change the status quo might intervene vis-a-vis the creation or articulation of these stakes in property, potentially altering land's underlying politics and working at extents broader than the standard architectural brief. What I'm suggesting is an intransitive architecture, one without a direct object. Having identified our design method, the interest, we investigated case studies that could help illustrate how land operates in the real world. We documented 10 such cases, of course there are more, and made plaster models for each of them, which you'll see in the gallery. And from this research, we were able to distill 5 approaches towards the design of interests. And I will talk about those now. The first one is the creation of interests. So, create interests. The creation of a class of interest generates a new geography of values and uses superimposed onto existing legal landscapes. Such geographies may serve to exploit the 4-dimensionality of property or implicate pertinent resources. An example of that is in Texas in the mid-19th century. The constitution of that state permitted the severance of the surface rights and the subsurface rights, allowing the exploitation of oil to happen separate from the ownership of the surface. Articulate interests. The articulation of interest involves the rescripting of property by subdivision or legal social requalifications. Within any given parcel, interest can be spatially and temporally reorganized without altering property boundaries. An example of that is the district, business improvement district, historic preservation district. Fragment interests. Fragmentation of property involves a geographic or legal scattering of interests. This complicates possession and the extraction of economic rent due to the contingency involved in managing non-contiguous portions of a parcel. An example of this is in the South after the Civil War. Ex-slave landowners did not claim contiguous parcels of land, but very scattered and segmented ones, and they shared them between each other. Consolidate interests. The consolidation of property interests involves the physical aggregation of separate parcels or interests therein. The consolidation or pooling can serve as a form of insurance or a strategic legal exemption because resource pooling buffers external regulatory, environmental, and financial factors. And the final interest is property, no, it's not an interest, but it's a design approach for legal interest, is property technology. Technologies of property are external disruptions that cause the variables of the land regime to change. They may be legal, economic, or architectural. They may not directly impact law itself, but reconfigure the dynamics of property transactions and the costs and values associated with possession and use. An example of that is the barbed wire fence, which in the early 20th century, I believe, was invented, permitted subdivision on a scale that was previously unseen. In the West, ranch land was normally open and not parcelized. With the invention of this fence, which could be rapidly deployed by anybody, there was a huge subdivision and parcelization movement that happened in the West. So, based on these approaches, what the main object of the fellowship has been to make a film which illustrates design proposals for each of these approaches. So I will show you one of them here. It's just a couple minutes. You can watch the other 4 in the gallery. The films were produced using data, GIS data, parcel data, and LiDAR data. And the premise behind the aesthetic dimension of the films, which you'll see in a moment, is to show an X-ray of the territory, showing both the object and the field, both the buildings and the property. And in conclusion, as long as design's conditions of existence remain bound to land, critical practice must contend with the institution that governs it. I'll play now the film. It has sound. Hold on. So that's it. There's 4 more in the gallery. Thank you.
Hello again. So I have my own series of thank yous to go through. There's a little pipe in the middle of that. You can't see it, but try to imagine. So to Don Fischhaber from Kohler, thank you for your enthusiasm early on in this project. Please extend a very special thank you to the rest of Kohler. We truly appreciate your unquestioning support during this process. To Ken McCoy from NIBCO, the pipe fitting company that helped sponsor the project, thank you for putting together endless spreadsheets and model numbers to build up our library of parts. To Jacob Piles and Luisel Sayas, making is close to my heart, so thank you both for enabling our thoughts and escape from the computer screen. To our Europe students, Trishani Patel and Anne Borick, thank you for your effort on this strenuous project. And lastly, but most importantly, I would like to thank the 3 people without whom this project would not have been possible. Thank you for your laughter, enthusiasm, perseverance, and openness to the odd, awkward, and projective. Valeria DeYoung, Michael Ferguson, and Abby Stock. I am sincerely awed at your dedication to this project. Thank you for joining me in this collective effort. We very much look forward to sharing our work with you in the gallery in just a few minutes, but before we do, I'd like to go back about 1 year-ish. I began my job talk with what is for me an interesting technological tension. In a home is not a house. Rainer Banham argues that what American architecture has to offer is piping, flues, ducts, wires, lights, inlets, ovens, sinks, refuse disposers, hi-fi reverberators, antennae, conduits, freezers, heaters. In essence, Banham concludes that American homes are no more than a hollow shell, a shell for our technological advances. He describes a historical rupture that divorces the art of architecture from another culture, one comprised of plumbers and consulting engineers. On the other hand, in his proposal for air architecture, French artist Yves Klein envisions an architecture that no longer has the responsibility to temper human environs. Rather, Klein's proposal sets architecture as the air conditioning of vast geographic residential spaces. The illustration shows a proposal for protecting a city by means of flowing air. For Klein, while mechanical equipment itself becomes an important piece of the dialogue, he renders machinery in service of the miraculous, the architectural, the hedonistic. In air architecture, former requests for functionality are supplanted by more timely pleasures. Alongside my fellow fellows, we began to develop the concept for this year's exhibition as a whole. While looking for the common threads in our work, we were struck by the following text. It becomes more pressing for us to look around with new eyes and to invest our energy and creativity in creating a better world out of the things around us. Looking to the things around us became the pedagogical lens through which Office, for example, began to develop the work. Unpacking these two conceptions for our climatized worlds through a framework which looked into material culture, we sought to further a mandate to make it our own, to appreciate, appropriate, and reimagine the logic and potential of object and material. And if you've ever been in this auditorium with me before, you know that my slides tend to be extremely on the lighter side. So you will see more appropriately contrasted drawings in the gallery of these. Apologies for that. I came to focus on a room within the domestic setting, one that sought to address both the mechanical and the pleasurable, the banal and the luxurious, the simple and the complex, the ideological and the innate, the variation and the copy, the recipe and the custom. It is a room that measures 5 by 7 feet. Do you know which it is? A standard of deviation is a measure of the amount of variation amongst a set of values. A low standard of deviation, therefore, indicates the expected, the normal, the standard, an average. If the mass-produced is now the image of banality, of the replicable, then the standardized bathroom is the epitome of the norm core. A microcosm of copy-paste logics, the domestic bathroom remains a recognizable block against even the most provocative of typologies. It is a given. If 1950s Americas told us what the domestic bathroom is and how to shop for it, Ching, Ramsey, and Neufert showed us how to draw it. The bathroom is the simplest of design challenges, for it is no challenge at all. The contemporary bathroom has been reduced to a mere recipe for specification. As both ambitions and expectations for deviation run low, the task of bathroom design is often delegated to the most inexperienced members of the contemporary architectural firm. Interns and junior architects pick the most tasteful fixtures, finishes, and moisture-resistant materials to make the room functional, often using catalogs and lists as a basis. If the normal is in, then the architectural specification, or spec, accomplishes certain degrees of hipness in its banality. Is it time for architects to speculate through the logic of the architectural recipe? In the imaginative spirit of instruction masters like Sol LeWitt, 9 speculative bathrooms in the format of a scattered showroom begs the question, how can the architectural recipe exploit the seeming simplicity of, how can the architectural discipline exploit the seeming simplicity of the architectural recipe toward meaningful variation? 9 speculative bathrooms seeks to make a case for architectural speculation. The showroom walls bring together the scattered representation methodologies of bathroom design. These are used by different trades: the architect, the engineer, the plumber, the manufacturer, and the homeowner to design and depict this too oft neglected architectural space. With the logic of the architectural recipe, the fixture and plumbing parts at its core, the exhibition brings together disparate forms of architectural representation: the spec sheet, the product sample, the patent drawing, the plumbing isometric. Aesthetically, the exhibition draws on the moment of rough framing, the fleeting moment when architecture's guts are exposed, understood. With the fixture showroom, to bring plumbing water refuse quite literally out of the hidden cavity of the wall. A surface-level perusal of any readily available architectural guidebook provides a plethora of functional layouts for the domestic bathroom. A deeper look into the matter surely identifies direct instructions towards a bathroom's logic, use, and standards for design. Yet a deeper dive into a standards manual and the designer becomes quickly aware of the functional benefits of configuring a series of predefined fixtures: tub, shower head, toilet, and wash basin, single file, along a single wall. This wet wall's internal cavity becomes the thickened hideout to a series of supply and refuse mechanics, a series of water and gas infrastructures that connect the room and the human body to the city at large. Domestic architecture is tasked with providing the site of abjection. Yet, for such an innate task, bathrooms across time and culture present very different demeanors, albeit also some similarities. What does the architectural space of abjection, one for casting off excrement, sweat, soil, say about a culture's association to values, custom, sustainability, and its ethos? In a popular YouTube video titled Toilet Ideology, Zizek states, even the most ordinary everyday objects can be objects not only to use them, but to think with them. The bathroom is not innate, it is not neutral. The bathroom standardization is rather a stronghold of civilization, a purveyor of culture, and a defense for lifestyle. It is pure ideology. A series of bathroom layout deviations appear to offer solutions in the event, a series of bathroom layout deviations appear to offer solutions in the event of distinctions in taste or means, yet such alternatives are described as subpar conditions to the ideal. The full bath, the three-quarter bath, and the half bath describe the loss of a fixture, the bathtub and shower, respectively, which curiously demerit either as bathrooms at all. Through the relentless nature of prefix fixture specification, the bathroom has literally been reduced to the lowest common denominator. Its conception is as mathematical as our use of it. Ironically, individualistic values towards use, pleasure, relaxation, collectivity, environmentalism, or other find no ally in the American dream's domestic bathrooms. Today, variability in choice in the modern domestic dwelling and common architectures beyond is compatible only with the reshuffling of its standardized parts. The bathroom and its plumbing infrastructure is constructed of predefined and pre-manufactured products, parts, and pieces. Hence, if the mass-produced room is a combination of predefined parts, can the bathroom embody a gestalt that challenges predefined notions of its fixedness through the creative recombination of its parts? The bathroom presents us with the most innate, tactile connection to water from within the home. Despite the tectonic and sensorial potential of these wet spaces, the contemporary American domestic bathroom has evolved into an unexperiential site, moderated by the relentlessness of fixture dimensions. In their description for bathing again. The architects state, if bathing once meant an extended period of socializing, relaxation, enjoyment, and semi-collective self-care, today it has been reduced to an isolated act of hygienic efficiency. Yet, mechanical speculation need not be restrained by practical contingencies, but rather tickled by its constructed ideological and sensorial potentials. This rupture in choreography between the function, visibility, and interface between public infrastructures and the user diminishes meaningful exploration on use, form, and interrelations between fixtures. Yet, we continue to specify according to these rules. Yet, we can and should subvert the simplicity of the architectural specification. Can architects exploit the simplicity of the architectural recipe to challenge assumed norms and codes and predefined ways of relating to each other in the world, or to instill new timely values? That is, to wonder, question, and imagine how a bathroom could be, or will we remain confined to an industry where bathroom, bedroom, fundamental spaces of our everyday existence are no longer spaces to be challenged, but standards to be met? Rather, can the architectural mind be inspired by the logic, banality, and systemic nature of product curation, selection, and specification? The tools of the architect today include AIA contracts, construction documents, digital models, specification manuals, schedules, catalogs, and materials libraries. Regarding systems infrastructures, schedules, and budgets, we keep these technologies out of the purview of the architectural imaginary. Architecture can instill change through its depiction of reality by providing a new pleasure, a new habit, or even the anachronistic reconsidered in a new idiosyncratic light. New and variable standards that focus on the optimistic premise that the way of the world is not predetermined. Speculative specification calls for the utilization, misuse, and exploitation of architectural product curation. Speculative specification asks, how can architectural product selection in the bathroom or otherwise become a creative or subversive act? What can be specified and how is open to the architectural imaginary. Speculative specification takes on the predominance of the architectural recipe towards meaningful variation. Thank you.
So I'd like to start by acknowledging the people who I was lucky enough to collaborate with. Thanks to Max and Linda for sticking it through the entire process of designing, fabricating, and installing the parts. David for getting the model making off the ground. Chris, Juan, and Mariana for providing crucial installation assistance, and Michaela for her fantastic research work. Thanks also to Jay, Amanda, Gabrielle, and Carl from 555 for such a fun and eye-opening collaboration. And lastly, thanks to my cohort of fellows, Gabriel and Liz, for our many illuminating conversations this past year over homemade tacos, salads, and dumplings. My fellowship project is on parts. For me, it's a kind of universal lens with which to investigate a series of topics and pressures facing architecture today. Parts is where the social and the physical meet in the act of building, as this image suggests, and refers both to the forms with which we can consider to be the building blocks of a project, as well as to the forces that bring those forms together. This approach views architecture as a way of thinking, and similarly in absorption and repositioning of techniques, not only within the architecture discipline itself, but also between architecture and other modes of cultural and social production. Constructivism was emblematic of this approach where architecture, art, and design was merged as a total project in response to societal change. Lissitzky's lithographic print beat the whites with the red wedge, imbued form with social purpose, but also hinted at an aesthetic of parts in motion. Lissitzky writes, any organized production, whether it be a house, a poem, or a painting, is a useful object that does not isolate people from life, but helps them organize it. The idea of parts in motion aligns with the notion of being modern as dealing with a world where the only constant is change, a condition that still defines cultural production today. A very direct translation of that idea into form is Lubov Popova's design for the Belgian play Magnanimous Cuckold, which turns the stage set into a reconfigurable montage of objects in motion with the actions of the performers so that the two become one. Alexander Veslin's stage set design for Man Who Was Thursday also illustrates this analogy. In Russian Constructivism, Art into Life, Anatoly Sekovich writes of Veslin, quote, "Inasmuch as the tempo of modernity was rapid and dynamic, its rhythm precise and mathematical, modern art had to match that tempo." In a further nod to Part 2 Ho, he writes, "In the object constructed by the artist, each element is materialized force and cannot be arbitrarily modified without disturbing the expedient performance of the given system." While modernism and postmodernism are typically viewed as antithetical to each other, there is a shared undercurrent in regards to Part 2 Ho theory. In Complexity and Contradiction, Robert Venturi writes, "I like elements which are hybrid rather than pure, boring as well as interesting, conventional rather than designed. These statements are surprisingly relevant still for a number of young contemporary practices. For Venturi, the difficult Ho was what kept the complex array of disparate parts inflected towards each other." In what has been characterized as a rebuke of postmodernism, Kenneth Frampton writes, "The attempt to isolate atomized elements such as morphemes is in the end a kind of reductive pseudo-scientific project which just leaves you with the banality of pieces, such as a door is a sign of a door, rather than with any notion as to the social-cultural complex desire of a species being to realize itself collectively." Instead, Frampton calls attention to the agency of yet another part, writing, "The joint, that is the fertile detail. It's the place where both the construction and the construing of architecture takes place." All of these examples suggest a breaking of an established order through a return to the part, the fundamental elements that has accumulated over time into our shared contemporary environment. When the constant change that already underlies our society becomes extreme in events such as the 2008 financial crisis, the projects also become more explicit or direct. In his catalog for the 2014 Venice Biennale, Elements of Architecture, Koolhaas writes, "The fact that elements themselves mutate independently of each other according to different cycles and economies and for different reasons turns any building into a temporal assemblage, a mix of the Middle Ages and futurism. We examine architecture by zooming in on the micro-narratives embedded in the fragment." I find this idea fascinating, shifting architecture from the design of any single building to being, as I like to say, a part of a continuous spectrum stretching into the past and future. The Biennale stopped short of proposing a project, but this has been taken on by practices such as De Wilder Wink Taliu, which has interpreted the project of parts as a closed reading of the existing tectonic context which their practice is rooted in, and intermixing these relationships with added parts that add a moment of difference. Their exhibition for the 2016 Venice Biennale tackles this head-on by focusing on craftsmanship in relation to the notion of scarcity. Jesus Vesallo outlines the projective potential of these practices in Seamless, which, as a side note, is also what in part inspired our exhibition title. He writes of the work in the book, "Through their irreverent and stubborn insistence on reality, they offer us a return to a broader material culture, this time with the freedom and mandate to make it our own." And to again reference back to the idea of architecture as a making of techniques, Theaster Gates' recent project for the Stony Island Arts Bank in Chicago merges ideas of art, architecture, social change, and economics. So the organization that I reached out to and ended up working with is called 555 Arts. 555 Arts is an organization of artists that started here actually in Ann Arbor. So you can see on the map here, this is where the current YMCA is. So this was about 2 decades ago between Huron and Washington Street, where there was this warehouse building where artists and small retailers congregated and hosted various events, art exhibitions, and areas for making. Over the years, 555 has moved from building to building. So this is the Michigan Tent and Awning building in Detroit, which, as an interesting aside, is the building that I just showed you that Prince Concept is working on now. So while they were there, 555 began to root themselves in Detroit and constructed exhibitions within the space. So here you can see an adding of material to the existing structure where they began to bring in spaces, local artists, and give them spaces to display their artwork. They also occupy the former 3rd Precinct Police Station in Detroit. So this is an installation where they actually engaged with the materiality and the construct of the jail cells within the police station. And that provided kind of a powerful backdrop for certain individuals to question larger social issues, such as police brutality and how art can act as kind of a mediator. And their current building is at the former Banner Cigar Company building, which was designed by the architect Louis Kemper, perhaps within our circle, a lesser-known Detroit architect, but he actually designed a variety of sort of still long-lasting iconic buildings in Detroit. This is a Sanborn map of the building itself, showing kind of the markings in the Sanborn map that showed kind of what happened in the building and the different activities on each level. The neighborhood is Potown, which in the early 20th century was a neighborhood where Polish immigrants came to, and there was, interesting enough, kind of this small but significant tobacco industry where tobacco was imported from Canada, and then it was rolled into cigars, and that kind of dissipated in the mid-20th century, but the physical remnants of that can be still seen in the neighborhood today. The neighborhood also had an interesting connection to metalworking. So a lot of the residents in Potown worked in metal factories. The high school that was right across the street from the Banner Cigar Company actually had a yearbook that was called the Crucible, which is the device that you melt the metal in before you pour it into a mold. And also, Potown has had a contentious history where the GM Detroit Hamtramck assembly plant was constructed just north of the highway on the northern edge of Potown. And that led in part to kind of an abandoning of the neighborhood because a lot of the homes were razed, and in conjunction with Detroit's financial troubles and the evacuating of kind of the moving out of the central city into the neighborhoods resulted in scenes like this, where the metal or a lot of the material was scrapped out of the building, including all of the metal piping, the conduits, all but essentially the necessary structure. So this is a photograph of the building when I visited in late last year in the condition that I found it. What really drew our attention were the metal elements that were left. For example, this column to beam connection detail in the basement of the building where the wood columns transitioned to the cast metal columns, which then supported the wood beams, then supported the wood joists, and then the flooring. This is on the top floor where there are all these columns that were added later. And this structural issue was actually caused by the scrapping of the metal pipe that ran through the middle of the building that drained all the water. So in absence of that pipe, the water began to collect at this portion of the building and begin to sag the structure. So some of the pieces that you see, well, in particular, the truss that we designed is a solution that we discussed with Peter von Bülow, the structures professor here, on how to address this condition where we cut these existing columns and turn it into a truss to add stability back into the sagging beam. We referenced early kind of historic building structural diagrams. In this example, you can actually see an example of a historic building where it was designed with this truss detail itself. And we also kind of played with the relational elements of structural forces, such as columns and structure decreasing in size going up through the building, and also the connection to the footing in the ground. So 555 also does metal casting, and we found this to be really interesting because rather than kind of it's the reverse idea of scrapping metal in terms of bringing metal back into the building and turning it into art. And that also allowed us into another way of questioning the standardized part. So we were inspired when we visited on site, seeing this metal pour just kind of happen as a condition of the pouring process itself. And we very quickly collaborated with 555 on designing a series of custom architectural parts that suggest a new relation between the structural elements of the building and connect to structural, social, and organizational forces. So this is an image showing the process of the mold making itself, where we created these boxes, where we set, this is called the lost foam method, where we set hard foam pieces into the mold, poured sand around it, flipped it over, poured metal into the foam and allowed the foam to burn out. And then the leftover spill became actually an integral part of the designed final piece. So here are the molds kind of in the production line, where you can again see this top part only suggests how far the metal can pour. And then the two white strips in the middle are the foam burn out pieces that are the kind of hard structural connections. And this is an image of one of the pieces after pouring. So you can see the uncontrolled portion of the metal landed where it is. So that was part of our intention, a play on the standardized part where the kind of functional form of it remains the same, but its expression becomes different through the method of making these forms. I'm not sure this will play, but this is an image from the metal pouring process itself. So the fire and the smoke that you see here is the hard foam inserts beginning to burn out, and then the metal, the kind of uncontrolled pour portion starting to spread. And we kind of had this cathartic moment where we were able to break the metal out of the sand as kind of like an unearthing of a baked good or something similar. And interestingly enough, as part of this process, these are things that we never kind of anticipated going to the fellowship project, but the different imprints that the process left on the metal pieces. So the smoother, kind of more radiant surface of the poured portion versus the places where the foam had buckled against the sand. And then the mix of the two textures created these really interesting seams along where the foam met the sand. And then kind of to tie to the very beginning image, the act of making itself became this collective community act where we had this all-day pour where people kind of filtered in and out and offered a hand to help and kind of make these pieces, bring the pieces down the production line. And then we have this kind of team photo where myself, Max, and Linda kind of inadvertently stage ourselves as kind of a superhero team, where you can see on the top is the existing metal bolt head that creates some sort of tie to the beam, the wood beam on the inside, and holds it in compression to the brick on the outside of the building. And we noticed that the bolt heads on the very lower portion of the building where people could reach it was actually scrapped. So we casted these bolt heads in a variety of configurations, and this shows us kind of repositioning it where it was meant to be. And then to close, the installation itself manifests as a possible architectural project in between image and reality, parts and whole, and architecture and the forces that influence it. The installation presents three representations that collapse scale, time, and reality, offering multiple ways for architecture to operate as parts in a complex existing environment. Photographs frame the intersections between the building's material past and its present transformation while suggesting at future organizational frameworks. A large-scale physical model distills the banner building into relational elements open to reinterpretation and reconfiguration. And you're welcome to play with the model a bit gently. And finally, the installation itself offers a chance for the 5 parts to perform at full scale, placing the visitor within one of many possible scenarios for the building's future staging. Thank you.